Imagine being a father, faced with the heart-wrenching choice between your daughter and the woman you love. It seems like an impossible decision, right? But what if that choice destroys everything you've ever cared about? What if the person you thought you'd be with forever leaves, and you're left with nothing but the consequences of your actions? David Simmons had always been a family man. He and his wife, Rebecca, built a life filled with love, and together, they had their only daughter, Emily. They were a happy family, and even when times got tough, they always had each other. David worked hard as a construction manager, while Rebecca stayed home to care for Emily, who would be 17 years old when tragedy struck. Rebecca had always been healthy, but suddenly, she was diagnosed with cancer. The news shattered their world. David tried everything he could to help, but after months of hospital visits and treatments, Rebecca passed away. Emily was devastated. She had lost her mother, and her father was no longer the man he used to be. David couldn't handle the grief. He couldn't cope with the loneliness that surrounded him every day. In his pain, he started to withdraw from Emily, the one person who still needed him. She, too, was lost in her grief, and they both found it hard to talk about their feelings. A few months later, David met Clara. She was kind and gentle at first, offering David the comfort he was so desperate for. Clara was a little younger than Rebecca, and she seemed to bring light back into David's life. Slowly, he started to open up to her, and their relationship grew. David felt like he was ready to move on. But Emily didn't see it that way. From the moment Clara moved into their home, things started to feel different. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that her father was moving on too quickly after her mother's death. Clara was kind to her at first, trying to get to know Emily and be a part of her life, but it always felt forced. She would smile and ask about Emily's day, but her attempts to connect were shallow, like she was playing a role. Emily, still grieving her mother and struggling with the idea of someone new in their home, began to retreat further into herself. She spent most of her time in her room, away from Clara. At the dinner table, things were awkward. Clara would try to make small talk, but Emily's responses were short and cold. Clara's presence felt like an intrusion, like she was trying to erase the memory of Emily's mother, replacing her with someone who felt like a stranger. It wasn't that Clara was a bad person. Emily just couldn't understand how her father could so easily let go of the woman they both loved. The tension between the two grew over time. David, caught in the middle, tried his best to mediate, to smooth things over, but his efforts only seemed to make things worse. He'd say things like, "Clara just wants to get to know you, Emily," or "We're a family now, we should try to get along." But every time he spoke those words, Emily's heart hardened a little more. She didn't want Clara in their family. She didn't want anyone replacing her mother. David, feeling the weight of both women's expectations, was torn. He wanted to keep his promise to Clara, to make her feel welcome and loved, but he also didn't want to lose Emily. The harder he tried to make them get along, the more they seemed to drift apart. He found himself stuck between two worlds, his new life with Clara, and the life he once shared with Emily and her mother. But instead of bridging the gap, he felt like he was being pulled in two opposite directions, unable to make anyone truly happy. One night, after another argument between Emily and Clara, the tension in the house had reached its limit. Clara, exhausted from all the fighting, stood in the living room, looking at David with a mix of frustration and resolve. "It's either me or her, David," Clara said, her voice firm but tired. "I can't keep doing this. She's making everything so difficult. I just can't live like this anymore." David stood frozen. He loved Clara, but he also loved Emily. This was a choice he didn't want to make. His thoughts were a blur, but Clara's words had a sharpness that made him feel like he had no other option. He had been carrying the weight of Rebecca's memory for so long, and now, Clara was offering him a chance to start over. But could he turn his back on his daughter? Clara wasn't giving him much room to think. "I'm not staying if she's here," she said, her voice resolute. "I've had enough. This isn't how I want to live." David felt a heavy weight in his chest. The thought of losing Clara, someone who had been a source of comfort after losing Rebecca, was terrifying. But Emily was his daughter. He couldn't ignore that. Still, he couldn't ignore the pressure Clara was putting on him. He was tired and emotionally drained, and the thought of finally finding peace with Clara was tempting. But at that moment, David made a decision. He told Emily that she had to leave. "Dad, what are you saying?" Emily's voice trembled as the words sank in. You're choosing her over me? David couldn't find the words. He felt numb. He couldn't look at Emily. He couldn't look at the pain on her face. He had made his choice, but it didn't feel like a choice at all. It felt like he was being pushed into it. Emily stood there, her eyes wide, unable to comprehend what was happening. You're asking me to leave, she repeated softly as if trying to convince herself that this wasn't real. David just nodded, his throat tight. He couldn't speak. The regret, the confusion, it was all too much. He wanted to take it back, but he knew he couldn't. The words were already said. Emily slowly turned and walked away without another word, and David watched her go, feeling a deep ache in his chest. Clara wasn't pleased with David's hesitation. Emily had nowhere to go. She grabbed her few belongings, some clothes, a photo of her mom, and a broken notebook, and left the house that night. She couldn't stay there anymore. The words her stepmother had said kept echoing in her head, "You're not wanted here." She spent a few nights with some friends from school. At first, they were kind and let her stay, but soon it became too much for them. They didn't have enough space or money to help her long term, so they asked her to leave. Emily understood, but it still hurt. Now, she was on her own, with no one to turn to. She wandered the streets, unsure of what to do next. The nights were the worst. She slept in dark alleys or any corner she could find, too scared to even close her eyes. She was only 17, but it felt like the world was much bigger and colder than she had ever known. She had no family, no home, just a backpack and a few belongings. The future felt far away, and right now, all she had was the street. At first, Emily didn't know how to survive. She tried to hold on to the hope that her father would come to his senses and ask her to come home. But days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She had nowhere to turn, and the streets were a harsh, unforgiving place. The streets felt like an endless maze, and every day was a fight just to stay alive. She would dig through trash bins to find food or beg for change on the corner. Sometimes, she'd get a few cents, sometimes nothing at all. But she had no choice, she had to keep going. The nights were the hardest. The cold would bite right through her jacket, and she'd shiver, wrapped in old newspapers or anything she could find to stay warm. It wasn't easy. Emily had to do things she wasn't proud of, but it was the only way to survive. She'd sneak into stores to grab food or water when no one was looking. Sometimes, she'd find a safe spot to sleep, but most of the time, she had to stay on the move. She learned not to trust anyone because trust had never helped her. She was alone, and the world felt like it was against her. There were nights when she would cry herself to sleep, wishing things could be different. It was hard not to wonder what would have happened if things had gone differently. Why had her father chosen his new wife over her? It felt like the whole world was falling apart, and she was just left to pick up the pieces. It wasn't easy, but Emily pushed on. She tried reaching out to people, but they turned their backs on her. The streets were harsh, and people were often even harsher. Then one day, when things seemed their darkest, she met Tommy. It was a rainy afternoon, and Emily was sitting under a doorway, trying to stay dry. She was hungry, cold, and tired. Her clothes were soaked, and she felt hopeless. Tommy was different from anyone Emily had ever met. He didn't look at her like she was broken or pitiful. For the first time in a long time, someone saw her for who she really was, a young woman who had been hurt, but was still holding on to hope. Tommy was kind, and that was something Emily had almost forgotten existed. When Tommy offered her a place to stay, Emily was shocked. She couldn't understand why he would help her. People had always used her in the past, taking advantage of her kindness. But Tommy wasn't like that. He didn't want anything from her. He just wanted to help, expecting nothing in return. At first, Emily didn't trust him. After all, how could she? She had been let down so many times before. She waited for Tommy to show his true colors, to prove he was just like everyone else. But he didn't. He gave her space and time, letting her take things at her own pace. Slowly, Emily started to see that Tommy was different. His kindness was real. He didn't pressure her. He didn't judge her. He just cared. As time went on, Emily started to open up to him. She told him about her past, the things that had hurt her. Tommy didn't judge her. He listened. And in his listening, Emily began to trust him. She started to believe that maybe she could have a better life. Maybe she wasn't defined by the mistakes of her past. With Tommy's encouragement, Emily decided to finish high school. It wasn't easy, but Tommy was always there for her. When she felt like giving up, he pushed her to keep going. When she succeeded, he celebrated with her. He believed in her when she didn't believe in herself. And because of that, Emily started to believe that maybe she could make something of her life. She worked hard, and after a while, it paid off. Emily got a job at an NGO, helping women and children who had been through the same struggles she had. It wasn't the easiest job, but it felt right. She used her own experiences to help others. She found purpose in it. For the first time in years, Emily felt like she was living, not just surviving. It was all because of Tommy's kindness and support. Meanwhile, David's life was falling apart. His marriage to Clara wasn't turning out like he had hoped. They fought almost every day. Clara didn't want children, and their arguments just kept growing. David tried to ignore it, but the constant fighting was draining him. His health started to go downhill, too. The stress from all the tension was taking a toll on his body. He felt tired all the time, and his doctor warned him he couldn't keep going like this. To make things worse, David's money started running out. The lifestyle he was used to, going out to nice places, buying whatever he wanted, was no longer possible. He had to cut back on everything, and the bills kept piling up. The money that once felt endless was quickly disappearing. Then, one day, Clara left. She packed her things and told David, "I can't stay with a sick man who has no money left." The words hit him hard. She didn't care about their years together. She didn't care that he was sick or struggling. She was leaving because it was too much for her. David was left all alone in an empty house. His health was worse. He had no money. And now, he didn't even have Clara. He had nothing left. Sitting in his empty house, David couldn't stop thinking about the mistakes he had made. He kept remembering the day he pushed Emily out of the house. He could still see her face, the hurt in her eyes when he told her to leave. At the time, he had listened to Clara and thought it was the right thing to do. But now, with everything falling apart, David saw just how wrong he had been. He missed Emily. He hadn't seen her in years and didn't even know where she was. He hadn't tried to find her. The regret hit him like a wave. He couldn't believe he had chosen Clara over his own daughter. He realized how much he had messed up. Now, he was alone, and he didn't even know where to start to make things right. All he had were memories of a mistake he couldn't take back. One afternoon, David was walking down the street, just passing the time. He wasn't in a rush, just lost in his thoughts. As he walked past a building, something caught his attention. There was a crowd outside and a banner that said, "Building a Better Tomorrow, NGO event." Without thinking, he stopped. It wasn't like him to join random events, but for some reason, he felt drawn in. He stood at the back of the crowd, watching from a distance. Then, he heard a voice. A voice that made his heart stop. It was Emily. David couldn't believe it. She was standing at a podium, wearing a sharp suit, speaking to the crowd. She was talking about helping kids and families who had been abandoned, neglected, people just like she once was. David's heart dropped. She was so strong, so confident. He never expected this. As she spoke, he realized just how far she had come. She wasn't the lost teenager he'd pushed away anymore. She was a lawyer, helping people in ways he never imagined. But as proud as he was, he also felt something else: guilt. Deep, heavy guilt. He had made a choice years ago to send her away. He had pushed his daughter out of his life because he wanted to keep Clara happy. Now, standing there, watching Emily speak, David realized that he had lost her. And there was nothing he could do to fix it. He wanted to run to her, to tell her how sorry he was, but he knew it was too late. Emily had built a life for herself, without him. She didn't need him anymore. After Emily finished speaking, David gathered the courage to approach her. He took a few steps forward, his heart racing. But when she saw him, her face was polite but distant. She didn't recognize him with warmth the way she used to. She smiled, but it was the smile of a stranger. "Hello, sir," she said, shaking his hand. Her voice was kind but formal. "It's nice to meet you." David's heart sank. She had moved on. She didn't need him. I'm proud of you, Emily," he said, his voice shaking. But she just nodded and turned away, walking off to talk to someone else. David stood there, staring after her, unable to move. She had walked away from him, just like he had walked away from her years ago. That night, David sat alone in his house. The silence around him felt louder than ever. His mind replayed the events over and over. What had he done? He had chosen Clara over Emily. He had sent his daughter away, thinking everything would be fine. But now, watching Emily speak at that event, he realized the truth. He had lost her forever. The regret hit him hard. There was no fixing it now. He had made his choice, and now he had to live with it. Every day, the weight of his mistake would follow him. And he knew, deep down, that he would never get a second chance with Emily. That was the hardest truth of all. Moral of the story. The story teaches that the decisions we make today shape our future, and sometimes, the things we take for granted, like family, are the things we end up missing the most. David's regret shows us that no matter how much we may try to make a new start, some decisions can't be undone. Family should always come first, and love is something that, once broken, may never be fully repaired.